I am so delighted to be here in Vienna at the 10th Annual Drucker Forum and to be facilitating the conversation that we're all going to have here on a topic of critical importance. To everybody who's in this room and those of you who are listening in, what is the role that business must now play in society? We know that expectations for this role are changing. We hear it from investors, from customers, from employees, and from community members, many of whom are saying that for too long, that business has been too much focused on achieving short-term profitability at the expense of people and the planet. As a result, some believe that the human dimension of business has been shortchanged. So what now? And this morning, with this distinguished group of panelists, we're going to talk about that question, what now? And our panelists will share their own perspectives on the role that business must play, and also share their experiences about how they have been driving deep change within their organizations. So let me turn first of all to Mr. Vineet Nayar. You've been a successful CEO of a technology company, HCL Technologies, based in India, and are now bringing your extensive innovation and management expertise to Sampark Foundation in India. You have a track record of looking after the human dimension of business. So will you start us off this morning and tell us, what did you choose to do to be more human-centered, and how did you do it?
Thank you, and good morning. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity on sharing my perspectives on something which is very close to my heart. And thank you, Richard, for putting humans right in the center of this forum. It was long overdue. I'm glad it is finally done. I'm going to focus on the employees as part of the society and the human dimension. When the industrial age started, the word manage became very popular, of putting humans together and getting more output by collectively working together rather than what they potentially could produce individually. And that's the reason the whole gospel of management originated out of the industrial age. When the innovation age or digital age, whatever you call it, came in, managing people became irrelevant. Inspiring people became very important. So the question is, the human dimension of management is, how do you inspire people to do what others consider impossible? And I'd like to start my story with the story of a few ants. A few ants were sitting in a room, and they were talking about their aspirations for the future. The first ant said, I want to be the richest ant in the world. The second ant said, I want to be the fastest ant in the world. The third ant said, I've been to the Peter Drucker Forum, I want to be the biggest CEO in the world. And then there is this fourth ant, and they looked at Jim and says, hey, Jim Ant, what do you want to become in life? And Jim Ant said, I don't want to be an ant. I want to be a butterfly. Humans don't want to be ants anymore. They want to be butterflies. I had experience of working with two sets of butterflies, which I'd like to quickly share my experiences with you. The first happened in a legacy firm called HCL Technologies. The journey started in 2005. There were 30,000 butterflies in that company. And they decided to transform the company, which was losing mind share, market share, and talent share. Their journey of thinking went into question number one, what is the core business of our company? To create differentiated value for the customers. Where does the differentiated value get created? In the interface of the employee and the customer. Who creates the differentiated value which will help us grow faster? The employees. Hence, the most important question, what should the role of managers and management be? Hence was born the idea, employees first, customers second. The role of managers in management can be nothing but to enthuse, encourage, enable employees so that they can create a customer-first differentiated experience. Once the idea was born, the butterflies ran around and saying, okay, the idea is as innovative as anything which anybody else has done because it is possible to transform a company on cultural axis. The question is, how do we do it? With every impossible idea, there are enough people who will resist it because they believe it is impossible till you make it possible. So there were many series of steps these butterflies took, but one of the steps which was path-breaking is the fact that we opened, I was the CEO and vice chairman of the company, I got my appraisal done by 30,000 employees in 2005 and published the results for all to see. Confidentially, the appraisals were done and the results were publicly pressed for everybody to see. And if my rating went below a certain level, I will lose my job. I did that for the next 8 years. The number of employees increased to 1 lakh and the appraisals continued. So if you truly mean to put humans in the center of your strategy, and if you want to transform the company, then you have to show it, not talk about it. The impact, we grew HCL Technologies 6-folds in 7 years in profits, revenues, and market cap, and it was magic. The second journey of transformation was actually more interesting. By 2013, I was convinced that if you stay in India and belong to the 1% of the people who have been fortunate, there is a very large unfortunate bottom pyramid in India. Increasingly, me and my wife were getting convinced that the human dimension is not just a few employees who get salaries, but the human dimension is a lot more. Our gaze shifted to 144 million children in Indian schools. And different research shows that most of these 144 million children studying in rural government schools, in grade 5, cannot count beyond 99, cannot construct simple sentences. India potentially could have been or would become the biggest unemployable and unemployed youth population in the world if we are not careful. I quit my job. Me and my wife decided to set Sampark Foundation and decided to try and solve this problem at scale. When we looked at the problem was very clear. Not only that the learning outcome was not happening, but the government had doubled its expenditure in education, and the learning outcomes had reduced year on year despite the doubling of the investment. So when we looked at the problem, everybody said teachers are the biggest problem. Millions and millions of teachers are the biggest problem. They are not capable, they are not interested, and they will not teach. When we started looking at the teachers and saying, what is the human dimension of this transformation? We asked the same questions. What is the core business of Sampark Foundation? To create learning outcomes where there are none. Who and where is this learning outcome get created? It is getting created with the teachers, between the teachers and the children. It is a different story that the children have to work and then come to school, and the teachers are also, most of them are doing 2 jobs. But still, the learning outcomes gets created in the interface of untrained teachers and uninterested children. So what should our role be? Our role should be igniting that interface in such a way that the interest in learning outcome comes in. Where can we innovate and where can we learn? Our eyes shifted to 2 places. One, Bollywood. In villages, despite not having food, not having power, not having electricity, on Saturdays, people put up 2 bamboo poles and watch a Bollywood movie, which is a very immersive experience. And we said, can we bring that immersive experience to the classroom and ignite the classroom? Our second inspiration was the mobile phone revolution in India, despite no electricity in schools, where people are charging mobile phones using dynamos, using cycles. So can we create a device which is run by a battery-operated device, which can be charged by a cycle and doesn't need any electricity? And our third inspiration was Mary Poppins. Can we create an Indian Mary Poppins called Sampark Didi and put her into a sound box, bring the Bollywood songs and dances, and teach maths and English using that? Combine that with certain digital applications, we went to school. And today we are in 76,000 schools impacting 7 million children. Did it change learning outcomes? Remember I told you that in grade 5, children could not count beyond 99? Our learning outcome survey by independent survey was done by Government of India, and we found out that 89% of the children in grade 2 can multiply and divide and construct simple sentences. But the day I saw the human dimension of this change happen was when 2.3 million children stood on Village Square and performed an English play called My Family for 20 minutes when they could not have spoken a single word of English. I like to end by saying something very, very important. In the day of innovation, everybody is looking for inspiration. Inspiration starts from trust. If you need to create trust, you need to be transparent and you need to trust that employee will innovate. It is not the days of the CEOs anymore, it is the days of the employee. The human dimension of our society starts with the employee. Trust them and they will create magic. Thank you.
Thanks, Vineet, for your employee-first strategy and then talking about the learning outcomes and really achieving some dramatic results in India. Let's turn now to Constantijn van Oranje, who has graciously allowed me to use the English pronunciation of his name. So, Constantijn, your work in the Netherlands to really encourage entrepreneurship and startup companies gives you quite a different perspective on the role of business in society. And so we're eager to hear from you about what you've learned about this role from your work with entrepreneurs and startup companies.
Okay, can I stay here?
You certainly may.
Okay. So maybe just to build on the butterfly metaphor, I think everybody wants to be a butterfly, but not many people want to be a caterpillar. And to become a butterfly, you first need to be a caterpillar. And that's maybe a bit where the startups are. I mean, they're no better than other existing companies. But they're also driven by profit. They're also seeking to gather the best talent. They are out there to seek investment. The advantage they may have is that they don't have the same legacy. And usually they're built by people that want to change something. So there's a strong drive to change inherent to the business, and this obviously might change once the business starts to pivot, and we've seen that with Facebook and other companies that have grown to a size and maybe have changed their business model that deviated them from what they originally saw as their purpose. They need to grow fast. They need to scale. That's highly important. Which requires them to have a very strong purpose or value set, because otherwise you can't run so many different parallel processes and grow at that kind of pace, the 40% month on month, or that we've seen some companies do. So values and purpose are really important, especially at the beginning. Also, young employees typically seek purpose. That's what they want. They don't want to work for companies that do bad. So we're seeing that many of the kind of petrochemical companies are now facing problems and trying to readjust. And it doesn't mean that startups are inherently better. Again, it's just that they have a different starting position. And also to be able to compete as a startup with a company that has an established customer base, that has a global network, is extremely difficult. So you'll have to do something 10 times better. You probably have to deliver some kind of value to your customers that is far superior. So you have to know your customers better. And many companies have succumbed to a certain proxy for what they think the customer wants, or they'll do market research and they'll try to find a customer and deliver a certain service to them without really asking themselves the question what it is that the customers are valuing and what they're seeking and how customers behave. Also, to scale fast, generally you need to work with other parties. You need to empower not only your own teams, but you also have to work with suppliers or with markets based more in an open ecosystem. So that requires you to think also about what the other ecosystem partners can benefit, and you have to seek win-win situations, whereas the existing business might have a much more closed proprietary mindset because they have an established base which they are exploiting. So this kind of view of seeking collaboration instead of negotiating into kind of optimization for your own good and value is something that maybe differentiates startups a bit. Also, startups do not have the resources to staff a full CSR department or government affairs, public affairs, and they typically don't care so much. They care on growing their business, and their business should be inherently good in a sense that they need to motivate people to come there because they can't offer the same kind of salary. So people will want to work there. If the company has a negative or closed atmosphere, the staff you would not be attracted. You can't attract or retain the talent. But it also means that doing good is either an inherent part of the business model. I mean, they're into renewable business, renewable energies, or doing medtech or other stuff, or at least their business is not doing harm, because that would be very hard for them to actually also convince markets. Investors are also turning much more into looking at if companies are actually contributing to the good and would not invest in companies that are not doing that. But again, the staff would also walk away. So what does that mean for legacy business? I think most established businesses now are pretty well aware that you have to put the human at the center, that climate change is real, that you have a footprint, you have to deal with that. So the awareness is pretty high, at least at the companies that I've been working with. The execution might lag behind. It might be the CEO is very convinced. I mean, he's been to fora like this, or he's been to Singularity University, completely scared out of their wits what technology will do with you, and you'll be eaten up by all these AI companies. Every disruption is everywhere. But then, how do you translate that into your transformation of your organization? And because the irony is, when we're talking about disruption, is that the disruptor is in a much worse position than the established business. I mean, the established business has all the resources, has probably optimized processes, is a highly efficient organization. They just lack speed, agility, and the things that a startup do have. But once the startup grows, actually will have some of those latency and problems as well as they grow. But the challenge is, and I think it was put, this is what this forum is also about, but the challenge that business is facing is that we are living in a very fast-changing environment where technology, there are various technology paradigms actually coming together at one pace. So it's not one transition, but there are many transitions. We're seeing transitions globally in terms of energy, but also demography. The power balances, our multilateral system is in a state of flux. So in whatever situation you're in, it will be one that is changed. So the organizations that are more agile and more able to adapt to that change will be the ones that survive. And as I said, the legacy business is an advantage over the startup. So the odds are with you. We've seen fintech, and it's been out there for a long time, but most of the fintech developments have been absorbed by the actual banking system. And now, obviously, you've seen that many of the banks have been able to adjust, though the pace is really fast, and they have to adjust more. Which brings me to kind of the Brightline report, which I actually quite liked. I recommend everybody to read it. This is this idea of a continuous state of crisis. I think that's a bit overstating it. I think we're all trying to seek this burning platform for change, and I think the real issue is how do you change, or how do you get people to change at a time where that change is not a crisis yet. And that's because that's the advantage that the startup has. The startup is always in a state of existential crisis, seeking for money, seeking for clients, seeking for market, until they establish a certain scale where there's more continuity. But that drive keeps you on your toes, and that's very difficult to create if you have a large business. And so I think what this report says is, that in a crisis you have more strategic focus, decentralized decision-making, empowerment of people. All of that is more inherent to a startup. It is something you would want in your business, to install in your business in a more permanent basis. But I think the challenge is that crisis is becoming a permanent state for business. And you may not call it crisis, you can call it a permanent state of transition. And it really is up to also the CEO to give leadership to that. And we've seen that startups have founders that have that kind of drive. They still combine the purpose with the organization and with the DNA of the founder is still very much with the company. Whereas with corporations, though, that connection is lost. So if corporations want to actually go into that mode of agility and transition, they will have to organize themselves from the top down, and the CEO will also have to kind of assume a different role, because not only are you a process manager that has to manage all the expectations of the stock markets, of your non-executives, of your employees and all of the stakeholders, but you'll also have to be a bit more of an entrepreneur, driving innovation, driving change, and making your company able to absorb that change and respond to it. And I think so that's actually, in the end, I would say that's one of the biggest challenges, is that you can't just manage yourself out of this crisis or out of this transition. You have to acknowledge first that change is permanent, to be responsive to new business models, technologies, etc. You'll have to also empower the organizations, which means different kind of leadership, a different kind of engagement with the outside world, more openness, allowing innovations from the outside coming into the company. And all of that requires a relatively deep, also cultural change, which is more difficult to manage than a startup. So in the end, the leadership challenge for existing companies to change and adjust to this world is a bigger one than to grow and scale a company from zero.
Thank you very much for those thoughts. We're going to hear now from someone who is definitely not in a startup company. Mr. Jean-Dominique Senard is the CEO of Michelin, an iconic brand. So maybe he'll have a different point of view than Constantijn about the challenges that businesses face. Jean-Dominique, what do you think are the consequences for society when business doesn't attend to the human dimension? And how did you tackle the challenge of creating business models at Michelin that are more, reflect a more sustainable capitalism? I'll invite your comments.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honor to address this crowd. I'd like to offer you a few thoughts about what we think business should do now in society. And as you will probably understand, I feel that we have a really central role now to play. Where can we better be than in Vienna to evoke Friedrich Hayek, who, as you know, in 1944 was lamenting the decline of liberalism and our society's increasing shift towards state control of the citizens' economic behavior and daily lives. In my opinion, there are two major actions that need to be taken now as a matter of urgency. The first action is to work towards rehabilitating economic liberalism by fighting against certain excesses of capitalism. And the second action is to achieve this ambition by returning to a broader way of considering their responsibility in society on the part of the major economic players. So the first action, as I said, is to rehabilitate economic liberalism by ending the excesses that have led, slowly but surely, to rising condemnation of capitalism and, by extension, to distrust to business. Let's be clear. We must never give up on freedom. Would it be individual freedom, political freedom, or free enterprise in a system based on property rights and open competition? We know that no coercive or centrally planned model has ever been able to rival the efficiency of a model in which the energy of what I would call the spontaneous social forces is promoted or unleashed. Nevertheless, of course, we all understand that a perfect and ideal system should provide everyone with safe and decent living conditions so that the majority of the people and citizens might consider it as fair. I believe it is urgent for us to reduce excesses that in the past have transformed the liberal ideal, have also contributed to fragmenting our societies, and also caused the confusion of different concepts in public opinion, leading to the undifferentiated denunciation of liberalism, capitalism, and business. In turn, this has led many to believe that there are other, much more important concerns than preserving freedom. Now, if economic players fail to take such measures themselves, it should come at no surprise when governments rush to fill in the gap in order to fulfill one of their most basic duties, maintaining social cohesion. Maintaining social cohesion no matter what it costs to society. Social cohesion is, do we really need to be reminded, one of the prerequisites for sound and free economic activity, something that we have all learned and known since the days of Adam Smith. Now, when it comes to the second necessary action, if we do not believe that state intervention is required to regulate the behavior of economic players, well then businesses must take a much more holistic approach to their responsibility. And when we talk about responsibility, the question is always, to what body are the different economic players actually accountable? How can we name the actors involved? What do they believe they are responsible for? And do they have a shared understanding of what responsibility really includes? However, we all are aware there are two major trends which are at play. The first is the idea there should be a division of responsibilities within society. As Theodore Levitt wrote in 1958, welfare and society are not the corporation's business. Its business is to make money, not sweet music. In a free enterprise system, did he say, welfare is supposed to be automatic. And where it is not, it becomes the government's job. We all remember that. If we work on that assumption, a corporation limits its responsibility to its own economic efficiency. The second trend, which is at play, is the conjunction of the theory of agency, of the financial deregulation, and of the disappearance of the affectio societatis. This created a real imbalance between the influence of investors and that of managers on the corporate decisions. Economic questions have thus come to obey a logic of their own, apart from political and social issues. This trend is furthered by the idea that growth is the key to achieving social harmony by raising standards of living across whole society. In other words, if it's good for growth, it's good for everyone. And I say the increasing insulation of economic logic is thus de facto totally justified. But ladies and gentlemen, when the system goes off the rails and questions begin to emerge about whether unlimited growth is possible or desirable, and when signs of social fragmentation increase to the point of becoming a serious concern, this is what we experience today, notably in Europe, well then public opinion and governments tend to burden companies with new constraints. Would it be stakeholder input, legislation on CSR, taxes aimed to limit social fragmentation? Corporate managements at that point find themselves totally trapped and stuck between increasingly tight restrictions and the unyielding demand for results. The response, ladies and gentlemen, is not entirely in the hands of business. Far from it. But at this level, I believe we must bow to the evidence that business does not have a form of social and political responsibility. It really has a responsibility. This political and social responsibility should be embodied in a purpose that addresses all of the business's stakeholders and constituents, and which is openly communicated and shared. This purpose takes on full meaning when it unites the business's different constituents, its investors and employees, to achieve a common goal. Management forms a link between them, of course, determining what is reasonably due to each side. If in response to an essential political moral imperative, we can do business while regulating our own impact, we will then be able to do business freely and return with pride to a form of liberalism that seeks to serve the common good. What better agenda for a time when Europe is, as we know, trying to find itself. As a conclusion, I would like to tell you, quoting Schumpeter in 1942, who was speaking about the inevitable decomposition of capitalist society, emphasizing that capitalism is being destroyed by its own success. While we are not there yet, ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that the current outlook is far from bright. If it were, would we have been asked the question? So, what should business do in today's society? Carefully and candidly consider the trends at work in today's world to determine what changes should be made, and I will tell you, they will be profound. Then also, affirm and assume its responsibility in the face of a political reality that surpasses it, in the hope that virtuous, just, and honest men and women will take on political leadership. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a call to action on the part of business. Let's just wrap up this session of the panel. Yves Does, Professor Does from INSEAD, I'd just like you to offer your comments. Given your expertise in technological innovation and strategy management, how do you see business models evolving to meet societal needs?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. It's a pleasure being here. I've been part of or associated with the Docker Forum since the very beginning, and it's always a pleasure to come back. Now, to today's topic, well, first of all, we are in Vienna. And I'm going to, in a way, call upon three Viennese intellectuals, each of whom contributed very much to shape the world we live in organizing comments where I will echo some of Mr. Senard's actually concerns and characterizations. And then if we have time, I will try to say a few words about two companies I'm now researching, which perhaps offer elements or offer ways to point us in the right direction. So let me start with Vienna and the Viennese intellectuals. I mean, first Hayek. Hayek was an economist who essentially, and I'm going to be obviously very short, so I will not give full justice to the richness of any of the three. But Hayek, in a sense, revitalized capitalist or liberal capitalist thought by essentially saying if you have a world where knowledge is widely distributed but not fully shared, it cannot be entirely the same, obviously, and therefore the idea of some overall optimization would be very difficult except through the price mechanism. And essentially he was reviving, if you wish, an economic tradition which indeed had started with Adam Smith. At the same time, And he was writing at the time when Soviet system, if you wish, was a viable or was seen as a viable alternative in the 1930s and the 1940s. And essentially, Hayek is behind today's Western world to a large extent. At the same time, obviously, and we all know that, things were left aside, were not considered. There were externalities. Obviously, the environment and climate change is perhaps the biggest and the most pregnant and most challenging one, which was not taken into consideration. There were others. For instance, going back even further back in time, I mean, Bismarck introduced retirements and the beginnings of a welfare state back in Prussia in the 1860s or 1870s. But at the time, the average life of a retired person after retirement was about 3 years. If you look at today's longevity, if you look at the demographics of the Western world, you can also see that there are major challenges there. Yet, Hayek created, or liberal capitalism created a remarkably successful, a remarkably adaptive, one could say agile, society and civilization, despite ignoring some critical externalities. But we have to be careful. And there I want to bring in the second intellectual, in a sense Freud, Sigmund Freud. Freud wrote some very interesting pages on the value of civilization, and essentially opposing civilization as social order with the natural tendency so in human libido for aggression and aggressiveness. And as part of this thoughts on the value of civilization, he gives a big importance, and quite rightly so, to work, particularly when work is more intellectual, more creative, more thoughtful, but not exclusively. And saying, in a sense, one of the pillars of civilization is the fact that people work. And what do we see today? A lot of people don't work. We have very high unemployment, we have the gig economy, we have 1 billion people around the world, more than 1 billion people around the world, whether they are Uber drivers or people on the roadside in Africa waiting for employment for the day, who are in a precarious position with part-time work, flexible pay, and so on. We also have a situation where the famous 1% becomes a very huge issue in social integrity. We have 1% of the population having a totally disproportionate share of income and obviously also of wealth. The assumption was, again, the state would take care of market imperfections and the state would take care of the issues of employment and work. But, first of all, the state would take care of this via taxation, via subsidies, if you wish, the welfare state, and via regulation. And what do we find? We find that there are many loopholes in taxation, particularly on the part of global companies, so that the tax system is highly imperfect and basically is trying to race after more and more imaginative schemes for tax optimization. We find that the welfare state, given longevity and demographics, is simply no longer affordable. And also the geographical convergence of people into city and the difficulty in rural areas. We see it right these days in France, for instance. And we also find, whether we speak of regulation or taxation, that in one way or another, and I'm going to be perhaps provocative here, in one way or another, most states are to an extent corruptible. Corruption takes some very different forms in different countries around the world. In some countries it's around lobbying and the job you find after having been a civil servant. In some other countries it's about pure graft and money transfer. But corruption has been an issue in most countries. So the state is not fulfilling the functions that capitalism has not fulfilled very effectively. And indeed, in addition, some of the traditional social integration mechanisms that were, in a sense, protecting or building this feeling of community in a particular territory, in a particular country, these mechanisms have been eroding or have disappeared altogether. It used to be that schools were very well regarded. there was a meritocracy. What we find now in most countries, we are back to a system where you were born, from which kind of family, not what kind of schools you were able to go to, drives essentially how well you succeed. So schools no longer fulfill the same function. They no longer provide the same meritocratic success. We find also that the army and conscription has been disbanded in most countries except a few. We find that unions are on the wane, and we find that the church is much less important than it used to be, not even speaking of the Catholic Church being discredited by all the scandals. So we find that social integration mechanisms are no longer there. So what it means is business has been, I'm tempted to say saddled, has been tasked with a role in society which it did not call for. The idea of Friedman, which I think Mr. Senard was evoking, of saying, well, you get the business of business is to make money, and the shareholders, when the business is successful, can spend some of that money on charitable activities. That was the model of the Rockefeller and many others. It was still the model of Bill Gates. It may still be the model of Mark Zuckerberg. What we find today is the business activities and the social fabric are more and more closely intertwined, and the role, a greater role has been imposed on business. And my third Viennese is Drucker, of course. Tatiana said enough about just a few words that I will just say, in a way, Drucker brought back the responsibility of management, or the role of management, very much like Mr. Senard was saying. And the fact that business needs to be active in trying to handle those issues. Now, it is not separation between profits and charitable contributions. It is not doing CSR on the side, like many companies have been tempted to do. And what I want to do in the next 2 minutes is to mention two companies which are trying to do very interesting things, to create business models that are both good business for making money, or good models for making money, but also good models for saving the world. These two companies are very different. Let me mention them. One is an unlikely company you may not know about. It's called Office Chérifien des Phosphates in French. It's a Moroccan phosphate mining company. And to cut a long story short, because time is very, very short now, what they do is essentially trying to be the spearhead, one of the leading companies, in transforming African agriculture from subsistence farming to commercial farming, and for primitive farming to intelligent farming. There are huge barriers, but in doing so, they both create a growth opportunity for themselves. That's the business side. They may also be able to solve perhaps one of the most pressing problems around food, nutrition, migration, the future of Africa, and the like. So some companies manage that integration. The other example I want to mention very briefly is a completely different example. It's a company called Lego, the brick construction company we all played with when we were kids. They have now recognized that the move to screens on the part of young kids is irresistible, like it or not. And they are driving together with Apple and a few other partners, creating what they call fluid play and learning, which is basically saying, how can we avoid the toxic side effects of kids becoming addicts to screens and turn this actually into learning and educational opportunities. Again, it's a way to make a ton of money. It's a way to sell more bricks. It's also a very lofty societal ambition. So I think more and more, and that will be my conclusion, the name of the game will be to try to create as much overlap as possible between societal ambitions and good business sense. Now, you can criticize me saying, well, OCP is state-owned, Lego is private and family held. What about publicly traded companies which are facing activist investors and shareholders and retirement fund managers and so on? I think that one is a real governance challenge. There are good examples. I mean, Mr. Polman will be, I think, with us in this conference. Indira Nooyi, who led Pepsi Cola for a number of years, was also a good example. But the challenge there is greater. So perhaps the discussion can be also on how do we make sure that publicly traded, stock market quoted companies do not fall behind in this social agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Yves. So we've heard a lot about some of the general conditions that we're facing now, some of the social realities, the institutional limitations. Let's talk very much now about management practices, if we can. And it certainly is a question we're getting from the audience. Each of you has deep experience working with managers who are making choices that produce results that are attentive to all of the stakeholders' needs. So, Vineet, tell me, just give us an example of what you did when you made a decision to put employees first. Tell us what one of the practices that you put into place at that point.
I think one of the big issues for us was the fact that we were growing slower than our competition. And we believed that if we increase the energy level, the clock speed of the organization by inspiring and motivating the employees, the tenfold growth which we were seeking would happen automatically. The question is, how do we do it? So what we did was we created, and innovation was a very critical aspect in the interface of the employee and the customer. So we created a digital portal which was in the interface of the employee and the customer. We asked the employees to come up with innovative ideas. They came up with innovative ideas, and the rating scale was handed over to the customer. So the customer started, giving on a 5-point scale, what did it think of the employee idea? And based on the number of points you earned, we monetized it. So step one was to try and galvanize more and more employees thinking about innovation. Once these points started coming in, then we started making employees compete in teams with one another. And slowly, through a democratic voting mechanism and point system, we had the 20 top ideas come on an annual basis at the board level. And all those 20 top ideas, which were democratically voted, some ideas which would started as A, combined with B and became AB. And those 20 ideas were given $1 million each. I think what we achieved in HCL through Employee First, Customer Second was a grassroots culture of innovation, a grassroots culture of responsibility of creating a differentiated value in the interface of the employee and the customer, which ended up creating such a unique experience for the customer. We became #1 in customer satisfaction in the world, and we became the fastest growing company in the world. So it created such a unique opportunity for us to be able to leverage a cultural transformation to create new innovative and differentiated experience for our customers, which I do not think we could have created if we had focused not on the human dimension, but on the non-human dimension.
So really putting customers and employees together and actually establishing some competition that employees enjoyed engaging in.
That is correct. And I think one of the most important things is to understand that the role of management is not to deal with the customers. We CEOs and general managers rush that I will take care of you and the employee reports to me. We said, no, we will take care of the employee and the employee will take care of the customer. The moment you invert the organization pyramid and throw conventional wisdom outside the door and make the management accountable to the employee and enthuse, encourage, enable, give him all the resources which are required, I can tell you magic happens. And that is, I think, what we achieved in that focusing on that interface.
To get magic to happen in companies is quite an accomplishment. Jean-Dominique, I'd like to ask you to tell us about, you have worked very hard to empower workers in a way that was different than decades before. What did you do, and why did you start this process of looking also at employees at Michelin?
Well, in a nutshell, I'd say, and perhaps to echo what you just said, everything comes back to the purpose of the company. If you stick to that purpose, and if I may, I would just summarize it under the signature of that purpose, which we care to offer everyone a better way forward. You can see that there are two major pillars in that purpose. First one is, of course, sustainable mobility, which is basically the business of Michelin has been there for 130 years. technology, innovation, customer focused, etc. But in the same time, the second pillar, offering everyone a better way forward, is making sure that everyone in the company feels well, has a focus on its future, and we are here to make sure that this future is secured and in the best way possible. If you miss one of these two pillars, you're lost. You can have one. If you haven't got the other one, it's over. So for us, it's a real conviction here. We need to have that. And when it comes to the second pillar I mentioned, the people of the company, well, that's where the whole story starts. Empowerment and accountability is the absolute key message and action that we are going through in Michelin as we speak. And a tremendous evolution, a total revolution of culture compared to what we used to live in the past 100 years. And it's not an easy game, by the way. It's not something you can just do with a click. It goes through training, through constant observation, testing, piloting, bringing people to understand that their role is changing. Empowerment, easy to say. It's very difficult to really action. People are ready for that. They want it. But then you have to make sure that the whole thing fits properly and that you don't derail the whole company because you've done too much. And so, empowerment, yes, at every level of the company, starting on the floor of every plant, to the very top of the company, that is, of course, myself and the executive committee. For a company which is large by 125,000 people, it's a huge avenue. Now, the most difficult part of it, when it comes to maturing on the empowerment side, which is, I think, the case today in Michelin, the most difficult part of it is real accountability. Because when you state that, it's easy to say, it's very difficult to really acknowledge. And when a population of a group like Michelin has been accustomed to such a different way in the past, you have to be very, very cautious in finding the right balance. But if you miss empowerment, you miss everything, but if you miss accountability, well, then you have another problem. So I just want to share with you the fact that we are moving very fast in that direction. Things are really incredible. The engagement of the people, the commitment is increasing year after year. We can measure that very clearly. So we are very proud of that. But I know it's a long journey. And it's not the easiest when you get to the summit. Make sure you've got everything there. Empowerment and accountability.
Constantijn, please.
I'd add, does this work? Yeah. I'd add also accepting risk or failure, and what you mentioned is experimenting. You know, try to experiment and then and allow people to fail and make a transparent culture around that. And I find that that's still in most companies that's where it goes wrong. There's a lot of good management ambitions around change. Well, then, when people then actually do start to, when they are empowered and they do the wrong things, that the culture is not very forgiving towards that failure. So what I actually like a lot about the way that a company like Amazon works is that they really drive this can-do mentality in the company. So if you want to, a typical organization will know 1,000 reasons why not to do something, but they have turned it around and said, well, if you have a good idea and if you make a good plan, you're allowed to experiment, and we will give you the resources. But then with metrics in place, that if you fail, you fail fast, and then you move on to next things. And that part often misses in the organizational change.
Yeah, there's always a lot of talk about failure, but not a lot of acceptance of it. Yves, we're almost at time.
I just want to add two very quick points. I mean, one on I fully agree with everything that has been said. On the risk dimension, someone yesterday in a workshop brought an interesting point. He was from Bangladesh, and he was saying in very poor context, and OCP sees this in Africa too, taking risk is extremely difficult because risk used to mean starvation if you failed, and death, or at least starvation. So it's you have to be context sensitive there. And the second point I want to make in complement, what can companies do, is to establish clear ethical guidelines. In Lego, for instance, they call it guardrails, but they have a very specific set of rules around child safety, which they find very difficult now because on the internet you can access all kinds of things without control, which may be very inappropriate for children. But they have some very, very strong policies about, for instance, their alliances with movie companies, with companies like Google and so on, around how are we protecting child safety. So establish rules that have an ethical content and are basically providing the framework or helping define the framework.
We have 2 minutes left. I'm just wondering in these 2 minutes if we can very quickly bring this down to the individual actions that people take. We've been talking about society, we've been talking about business and organizational change. Many people in the audience, when they go back to work on Monday, what's one piece of advice you could offer to them to bring the human dimension into their own company? Just a quick thought. Vineet, do you have something?
Yeah, two quick thoughts. First is feel for people and not think about them. And the second is what Dalai Lama said very interestingly, that the best management lesson you can give to anybody is overuse of the word, I don't know.
I don't know. Okay, great. Constantijn, how about you?
Yeah, actually, my comment would build on that, is ask questions. I think the CEO is driving the change, and if he or she doesn't really live it, it will not really happen into the company. So this change has to be authentic, and it means that if you demonstrate that you don't have all the answers, but that you empower people to give those answers. And I think you can test that by talking, as a CEO, talk to a child. And if you can have a meaningful conversation with a child about dilemmas of your company, you know that you're probably talking in an open way, and you're actually inviting a child to unleash his or her real pure way of thinking. If you are talking in a closed manner, like most managers would, the kid will shut down. So if you can have a meaningful conversation with a child about your business, you probably have got your communications right, at least.
Great. Meaningful conversations with a child. We've got 20 seconds.
Well, perhaps very short. If you go back home, make sure your company has a purpose. And if it has, make sure that it relates, of course, to profits, but also that it relates to social and environmental consequences of the actions of your company. If that is not consistent with what we're all saying here, then speak out.
Excellent, thank you. And Yves, a final thought?
2 words. Add to vision the words values and virtues, and also embed them in your purpose.
All right. Well, thank you to all the panelists for these insights to get us started for the conversations to come. Thank you.